Hello there and welcome to this game review. So in this one we will talk about the concept of statics and dynamics, and these two are the two core concepts of chess in general and normal positional strategic chess. And this means in chess there are two types of advantages, static and dynamic. Dynamic advantages are characterized by those which are fleeting, so to say, those which are short term. For example, an advantage in development is a dynamic advantage because if the opponent gets enough time to finish his own development, the advantage of development will not be there anymore. So, for example, in the opening, if we have a big advantage in development, we should fight to exchange this advantage in development into something more concrete, like maybe material or an attack on the king or something else. And this brings us to static advantages. These are things which are more long-term. For example, a weak pawn or king safety. For example, if the opponent's king is in the center and it cannot castle, then his king is for quite a while going to be weak. Also, for example, material is a long-term thing because pawns don't evaporate on its own. So generally, to win a game, we need at some point both both dynamic and static advantages, usually static. For example, a pawn in an endgame will be win. So let's take a look at this game and see how we can use our dynamic advantages to our advantage as soon as possible. So it started as some French defense and white sacrificed this pawn. This is quite a trendy line nowadays. It doesn't really do too much as white will just want to get the pawn back anyway. Knight f6, queen e2, and knight c6, a good general developing move. White takes. At this point, white has two pieces developed against our one, but it is black to move. And this bishop on b2, it might be good if white attacks here, but if at some point black is able to play f6, then this bishop will forever be blocked, which means an endgame is perhaps something black wants, and here black can develop with tempo, queen d5, and this is a development move with tempo because it attacks the queen, and if white takes it, then now we have achieved something in the form of a pawn on d5, and this has opened our bishop, so now we can have harmonious development. The bishop can go to f5. For example, we can even play f6 to put a king here. Let's say the opponent develops, the bishop can go here, the king can go here, the bishop will go here, and this bishop on b2 is not very well placed, as it is biting on granite on f6. So this was a better move, but f5 is not really necessary. This is a big mistake positionally. Sure, it attacks the queen, but of course the opponent is not going to blunder his queen, and he goes back, and the problem now is that this pawn cannot go back. This means that this pawn has weakened two very important squares, e6 and e5, as the f-pawn will never be able to go back. As they say, pawns don't move backwards, so the consequences are very, very long-term. This means white now has a huge long-term advantage in these two squares. On this one there is a pawn, which white will be able to attack very easily through the e-file. And the square on e5 is also very weak. Now queen d5, but now we're developing a queen without tempo, so we're not really achieving much. Turn knight f3, bishop c5. Here white plays queen c3, which loses time. Here, of course, black is attacking the queen, but white could counterattack with d4, which is generally a useful move because it puts a pawn in the center, so it achieves one of the several opening goals. Okay, queen c3, bishop d7, black continues with development, queen e4, not losing time, king f1, and castles. So at this point, the advantages are clear. White has a big long-term advantage in the form of these two weak squares, which black will never be able to defend anymore, but black has a huge lead in development, and by huge I mean white's h1 rook is not in the game. So black should be interested in action as soon as possible, while white should be interested in exchanging pieces, trying to finish development somehow, and eventually to attack these two squares, as they will never become stronger for black. So let's see what happens. d3, queen g4, and queen g7. So now white has another long-term advantage, queen f4, but unfortunately this is a bit too slow. Here, interestingly, black should have moved the rook away from this bishop's diagonal to not lose it. And of course, white will take, and black will take with this pawn, specifically to open the f-file towards the pawn on f2. And even in the endgame, we can see that black has certain short-term advantages, even though he is a pawn down and even though he has weaknesses here. As long as white's rook doesn't get developed and black keeps the initiative, he has certain chances for counterplay against the f2 pawn. Instead, queen f4, and now white could have played a nice move, queen g3, which sort of traps the queen and makes black have to exchange, because otherwise we're losing the exchange here. So at this point, white is surprisingly winning. For example, here, now that white has solved his problem of the undeveloped rook, he now has a pawn advantage and also two weak squares as targets, not to mention h7 is now also a target. And black has no dynamics to show for it. His lead in development is gone because white has developed his last piece. So this is why when the dynamics are gone, the statics take over. So now we are absolutely lost because of the static advantages for white. Set queen c3, but now black gets the chance to develop the rook with tempo. Not like with tempo, but it's attacking g2, which could at some point be a big threat. And white doesn't understand the position, and he takes the pawn on e6 with the point that he is winning a pawn as a discovery check on c5. But something white doesn't understand is that his problems do not lie in material. He doesn't need any more pawns. He has a pawn advantage, and also, again, these two are weak, so he already has enough of a material or static advantage to win. Now, white's goals should be to avoid any possible dynamics, and dynamics could happen on the g-file with all of these pieces near white's king. So this is something white should avoid, and he should either start defending or trying to exchange queens, which would be beneficial generally, or maybe playing d4 to shut out some kind of pieces that are attacking the opponent's king. But instead, white goes for another short long-term advantage, but this one was completely unnecessary. And in doing so, he loses time. At this point, it was white to move, but now, even though white has won a pawn, it is now black to move. And black can again use his initiative to gain short-term advantages, and the rook g2 here is a very good move. The point being that if he takes, after this, white is now up a lot of material, but his king is completely naked. After rook g1, f4 is a great move, which has to be seen. The bishop is going to h3, the rook will go to e8, and even though white has a pawn and the rook for just a knight, white is lost because of the short-term factors, and he cannot defend his king on time. Checkmate is coming inevitably. So this is what black should have done. With bishop d5, this also makes sense. It's a bit slower. Now white understands that he should exchange. Black doesn't exchange. Rook g1. Now rook d to e8, which makes sense. But white has the only move h3, through which he is kind of defending. After queen g6, now black's pieces have been pushed back. White moves the queen. And now, objectively, white should be winning because he has two pawns, and he is very close to finishing development. One idea is to exchange off the rook, which happens in the game, and get the king out here. So again, black has to look for some kind of dynamics, and he has to create threats so that white is not in time to save himself. One example is knight b4. This simply attacks c2, and if white takes it, we can now take here, attacking g2 using the pin, and also threatening bishop e2. So this would be another example of looking for dynamic possibilities, because if black doesn't find anything dynamic, then he will lose in the long term, which kind of happens. Bishop takes f3, but this exchange isn't very beneficial. Now white has to worry about one less attacker, and after knight e5, now this useless bishop is also gone, and after these exchanges, black lost the move as well. And the more pieces get exchanged, the closer we get to the endgame, and in the endgame, two pawns will be enough to win the game for white. So now rook e1, trying to exchange more pieces. Black avoids it. Queen e2, queen c6. and c4. So white is kind of consolidating, and here king d8 was played, which is a very strange move. Again, black should desperately try to seek out some kind of counterplay, maybe try to attack this pawn somehow. At this point, it's quite difficult, as white has a few simple plans to finish development. For example, he can play a4 and try to exchange the queens. But okay, king d8, he gets checked, and here the simplest way to win would probably be to exchange queens, as without queens this king is not weak anymore. It can come out to f3, the rook will go to e1, and the game is technically over. And rook e6, queen d7, and the white takes this rook. And at this point, white is a rook up, so again, he has to get rid of the dynamics, but also he is a pawn up, and also he has kind of a strong attack. At this point, white has two choices, rook e2 or king e1. So rook e2 allows the perpetual, which happened in the game. King e1 does allow black to win back the rook, but at the end of this line, white plays rook e7 or even takes a pawn, and it turns out that white's attack is stronger because these pieces cannot give any checks, and there's no one defending c7. But white decides to go for the perpetual after not thinking for too much, and the perpetual happens, and black is of course happy with a draw, being down a row. It's quite an interesting game, and hopefully it was useful. And as a general rule, again, if we are down statically, we must look for dynamics. For example, here, something like rook g2 should definitely be considered, because our only chance of salvation here is to attack the weakened king while the opponent's rook and other rook is not in the game. Because if we start exchanging pieces, we will go towards an endgame, and in the endgame the two pawns will count. These are the two pawns. So hopefully this was useful, and good luck.